Radha Stirling, who is the founder and CEO of the group Detained in Dubai, which specialises in...
So,
what news do you have for me?
Well, I was going to string you on a little bit, but I have good news for you. Yay, finally. Yeah, he's been removed from Interpol, and we have a certificate that he's not listed on the Interpol database, and he's now free to travel.
Oh, great. That's really good to know. And thank you very much, brother. You were so happy because you went...
Welcome to the Interpol Red Notice podcast. I'm Radha Stirling, founder of IPEX, Interpol and Extradition Reform and Due Process International. I've been helping for people remove their names from Interpol since 2008. But we've recently seen an increase in extradition and Interpol requests coming from Qatar, and quite notoriously, Qatar National Bank, which brings us to today's topic of discussion, which is an Australian man who finally received the good news just last week that his Interpol Red Notice had been deleted. He'd been charged in Qatar over a bounced cheque that was forged without his knowledge, approximately a year after he left the country. He neither issued the cheque prior to leaving, he didn't have a security check with the bank, and nor was he ever aware of the source of this alleged cheque that he'd signed. However, bouncing a cheque in Qatar is illegal and warrants a prison sentence, usually around 1 to 3 years per cheque. The first time he learned of the Interpol Red Notice was when he was arrested in Prague, in the Czech Republic. He was jailed for 5 weeks. Then he was subjected to lengthy extradition proceedings, which he ultimately won. And during the extradition proceedings, Qatar declined to provide evidence of the alleged forged cheque. The amount on the cheque was only $37,000, and it was involving Qatar National Bank. Now, Qatar National Bank has been on the end of a number of Interpol cases and extradition cases over the past several years, and particularly since they made a huge donation to Interpol in 2018. They've probably become the leading abuser of Interpol in the Middle East. Now, during his detention and extradition proceedings, neither he nor his lawyer were ever provided evidence of the cheque. They were deeply traumatized. His family was traumatized, and they've suffered considerable financial detriment. They've considered legal actions against authorities in Prague for the unjust detention. In the past, the Czech has actually ruled that it was a human rights abuse to hold someone on the basis of a Qatar Red Notice. So this is not the first time that Czech authorities have actually been exposed to this abuse of extradition type of request from banks in Qatar, and therefore they should be developing a better way to deal with them. They shouldn't be keeping people in prison for 5 weeks, putting them through the extradition process, kind of knowing that they're going to be released. They should, like Italy has learned over the past few years, they've also had to deal with a number of Qatar and UAE requests, but they've learned how to deal with them. They know, in a worst case scenario, perhaps just ask you to stay in a hotel, but don't detain that person, don't hold them for months in prison when it's probably going to end up that this is an abusive red notice and it should never have been issued in the first place, and that person should not be put under any further sufferance than they really have had already, just having to deal with the legal system. The extradition process itself has actually been used by Qatar, even when they're fully aware that the request is abusive. They use it as a means to pressure victims into paying money to the banks, often money that's not even owed. Some people have resolved their debts with banks before they've left the country, but the bank has still pursued them as a means to extort them. They know that if you're arrested in Prague or Spain or Italy, and you're subject to those extradition proceedings, they know that your family, if you have a family with capabilities, will come to your rescue and potentially discharge or pay off the bank just to drop the notice. And sometimes it's cheaper to do that. If you just pay the bank $30,000, then you don't have to pay $30,000 to lawyers to fight this extradition. So it does come back to a serious abuse of Interpol's membership. So no evidence or investigation into the forged checks was ever made. Qatar declined to provide evidence to Interpol or in the extradition proceedings. My client was absolutely unfairly detained and was unable to work or see his children during the time that it took to remove his Interpol notice. Qatar has suffered no penalty, and Interpol has not compensated my client for his suffering and losses. Now, this abuse of power and proxy expansion of Qatar's jurisdiction into Western nations cannot continue. I've long suggested that compensation should be provided to victims of Interpol abuse. Financial repercussions is the only way to limit such abuse. And always remember, if you suspect that you may be at risk of Interpol red notice, please contact us for confidential expert advice. And that's to tourists. For example, we had a case of Connor Howard. He was arrested en route from Australia to Scotland, and then he was released. He was arrested for having a novelty herb grinder, which they assumed was something to do with marijuana, which it wasn't. However, they later put him on the Interpol Red Notice database, even though they'd released him, which led him to spend months in a Greek prison. Expats who have worked there, who have had debt, who have had employment situations or business partnerships, if you think that you might be at risk, don't travel. Check first. Come to us for advice. If you think that you're seriously at risk, we can generate preventative submissions to Interpol so that we anticipate what might happen and you don't end up like our Australian client here, where the first he knows about it is that he's detained in Prague. Thanks for listening. I'm Radha Stirling.